Resident Evil Code Veronica is one of the most divisive games in the entire franchise. For some fans, it's an absolute classic, a survival horror masterpiece with one of the series' best stories, most memorable villains, and some of the most important moments in Resident Evil history. But for others, it's a frustrating relic from another era, a game filled with outdated mechanics, questionable design choices, and moments that simply haven't aged very well. And that's what makes Code Veronica so interesting, because very few Resident Evil games are debated as much as this one. Some people consider it essential, others think it's massively overrated. Yet decades later, fans are still recommending it, discussing it, and arguing about where it ranks among the best games in the series. So that raises an interesting question. If you've never played Code Veronica before, is it actually worth your time? Does this fan favorite still hold up today? Or is it a game that's become more beloved for its legacy than the actual experience of playing it? Today, we're going to be breaking down the story, atmosphere, characters, gameplay, and the biggest flaws to answer one simple question: is Resident Evil Code Veronica worth playing? Let's start with what is arguably Code Veronica's biggest strength: the story. Even after all these years later, I think it remains one of the strongest narratives in the Resident Evil franchise. The game follows Claire Redfield as she continues her search for her brother Chris, a journey that quickly spirals into one of the most important events in the series timeline. What makes the story stand out isn't necessarily the plot itself, but the characters and themes at the center of it. Family, obsession, revenge, and loyalty play a major role throughout the entire game, giving the story a more personal feel than many other Resident Evil entries. The game also introduces some major lore and character developments that would go on to have a lasting impact on the franchise. In that sense, Code Veronica feels less like a side adventure and more like an essential chapter in the overall Resident Evil story. That being said, parts of the narrative have definitely aged. Some of the dialogue is cheesy, certain scenes are over the top, and the voice acting can be inconsistent at times. But honestly, that's part of the charm. Code Veronica embraces its weirdness in a way that few Resident Evil games do. And while not every moment lands, the overall story remains engaging from beginning to end. It's ambitious, memorable, and easily one of the main reasons people continue to recommend the game today. One area where Code Veronica has aged surprisingly well is its atmosphere. Even today, the game does an excellent job creating a sense of isolation and unease. A big part of that comes from its setting. Rockford Island remains one of the most unique locations in the entire franchise. From abandoned prisons and military factories to grand mansions and secret laboratories, the game constantly introduces memorable environments that make exploration feel rewarding. What I appreciate most is how unpredictable the game feels. Just when you think you've figured out the setting, Code Veronica throws something completely different at you. The result is a world that feels much larger and more varied than many of its contemporaries. The soundtrack also deserves a lot of credit, whether it's building tension during exploration or elevating major story moments. The music does a fantastic job reinforcing the game's atmosphere, and while the visuals have obviously aged, the mood hasn't. There's a constant feeling of loneliness throughout much of the adventure. Long stretches of exploration, limited resources, and the uncertainty of what might be waiting around the next corner. It all helps create the kind of tension that classic Resident Evil is known for. Not every area is equally memorable, and some environments definitely show their age. But overall, I think the atmosphere remains one of Code Veronica's strongest qualities. It's one of the few parts of the game that still feels effective regardless of when you play it. If there's one thing Code Veronica gets right, it's the game's cast of characters. Love them or hate them, they're memorable. Claire is easily one of the highlights of the game. She's determined, resourceful, and carries much of the story on her shoulders. Unlike some of Resident Evil's more combat-focused protagonists, Claire feels like an ordinary person constantly forced into extraordinary situations, and that makes her easy to root for. The game also introduces Steve Burnside, one of the most divisive characters in the franchise. Some people find him annoying, and others appreciate the tragic role he plays in the story. Personally, I think the character has a solid foundation, even if certain aspects of his execution haven't aged particularly well. And then there's the Ashford family, who are responsible for some of the game's strangest and most memorable moments. Alfred and Alexia are unlike any villains in the series, bringing a level of psychological horror and family dysfunction that helps Code Veronica stand out from other Resident Evil games. And of course, there's Chris Redfield and Albert Wesker. Without getting into spoilers, this is one of the most important games for both characters, and helps establish many of the storylines that would shape the future of the franchise. Not every character has aged perfectly, and some performances are definitely products of their time, but overall, the cast remains one of Code Veronica's greatest strengths. Whether it's Claire's determination, Steve's tragedy, the Ashford's insanity, or Wesker's larger-than-life presence, these are characters that leave an impression long after the credits roll. Now let's talk about the gameplay, because this is probably the biggest deciding factor in whether you'll enjoy Code Veronica or not. Simply put, this is classic Resident Evil. That means fixed camera angles, tank controls, limited inventory space, puzzles, backtracking, and a strong focus on resource management. If you played the original Resident Evil games, you'll feel right at home. But if your experience with the series starts with the modern remakes, there's definitely going to be an adjustment period. That being said, I actually think the core gameplay holds up better than many people give it credit for. At its heart, Code Veronica is built around exploration. You'll spend a lot of time searching for keys, solving puzzles, unlocking new areas, and slowly piecing together how the world connects together. There's a satisfying sense of progression, as previously locked doors open up and new paths become available. The game also puts a much greater emphasis on survival than many later entries in the franchise. With resources and inventory space limited, every encounter forces you to make decisions. Do you fight this enemy or try to avoid it? Do you spend your stronger ammunition here, or hold on to it for whatever might be waiting around the corner? Those choices create a constant sense of tension that I think still works incredibly well. Combat itself is fairly simple by modern standards, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. The focus isn't on pulling off flashy moves or mowing through hordes of enemies. It's about surviving with the resources you have available. Now, the biggest issue isn't the controls themselves, it's that Code Veronica can be extremely unforgiving. The game expects you to pay attention, manage your resources carefully, and think ahead. If you make poor decisions early on, those consequences can come back to haunt you much later. For some players, that's part of the appeal, and for others, it's gonna be frustrating. But once you understand what the game expects from you, there's a genuinely enjoyable survival horror experience underneath it all. Just don't go in expecting the smooth, streamlined gameplay of modern Resident Evil titles. This is an old-school survival horror through and through, and whether that's a strength or a weakness will ultimately depend on what type of Resident Evil fan you are. As much as I enjoy Code Veronica, there's one thing that holds it back more than anything else. Unlike most modern RE games, Code Veronica doesn't always do a great job preparing players for what's ahead. It's possible to waste important resources, miss useful items, or enter certain sections unprepared without realizing it until much later. As a result, some parts of the game can feel frustrating on a first playthrough, not because they're necessarily difficult, but because the game often expects the player to think several steps ahead. This is one of those games where preparation matters. Managing your inventory, conserving resources, and paying attention to what the game is telling you can make a huge difference later on. There's also moments where the pacing slows down due to backtracking. While exploration is a big part of classic Resident Evil, there are sections where you'll find yourself retracing your steps quite a bit, which may test the patience of some players. A few boss fights can be hit or miss as well. Some are genuinely memorable and tense, while others feel more frustrating than they probably should, due to the game's older mechanics and design choices. That being said, I don't think any of these issues ruin the experience. In fact, for some longtime fans, these are part of what makes Code Veronica feel unique. The game doesn't hold your hand, and it expects you to learn from your mistakes. But if you're coming from the newer RE games, these old school design choices will probably be the biggest hurdle you'll have to overcome. And ultimately, whether you enjoy Code Veronica may come down to how much patience you're willing to give it. So, after all these years, is Resident Evil Code Veronica actually worth playing? I think the answer depends entirely on what you're looking for. If you're expecting a modern RE experience with smooth controls, streamlined design, and quality of life features around every corner, then you're probably gonna struggle with Code Veronica. This is an old school survival horror game through and through. It demands patience, it demands planning, and occasionally it demands that you learn from your mistakes the hard way. But if you're willing to meet the game on its own terms, there's a lot to appreciate here. The story remains one of the most important in the franchise. The atmosphere is fantastic, the locations are memorable, the cast of characters are unforgettable, and despite its flaws, there's something undeniably special about the entire experience. In many ways, Code Veronica feels like one of the last truly classic Resident Evil games. It's a game that wasn't afraid to be challenging, wasn't afraid to be weird, and wasn't afraid to take big risks with its story and characters. Not every risk paid off, but enough of them did. And that's why people still talk about this game. That's why fans continue to recommend it. And that's why even after all this time, Code Veronica remains one of the most fascinating entries in the entire series.